Well, hello there, little masters, and welcome to another weekly episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast, where tonight we finally wrap up the book that introduced the world to hobbits in Middle-earth.
West to Hall, my friends. I'm Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the man of the West, the Sackville to my Baggins. Alan Sisto.
Oh, Sean, that's not cool, man, especially after last week's episode talking about that. Ouch.
Next time, maybe I'll make you the Baggins, my Sackville.
There you go.
Fellowship.
Well, whatever it might be. Well, folks, tonight is our retrospective on The Hobbit. After 29 episodes and, 35 hours of just discussion alone, we've finally gotten Bilbo there and back again. And what we'd like to do today is spend some time going back over some of the themes that we've seen throughout the book.
And we also have a few Hobbit questions still unanswered in Barliman's bag, so we want to try and get through some of those if we can, or all of those if we can, so we can start fresh in Season 3. I think there's enough here that we don't think we'll get to any of the Silmarillion questions we still have, so I apologize to folks who are waiting on those, but that's okay. Just keep those coming, and also keep the Hobbit questions coming. We'll continue to answer questions on books we've covered as we go forward. Don't be hasty and assume that we don't want to hear your questions just because we've moved on to a different book. Just keep those questions coming.
Don't be hasty. And because this is our retrospective, we are going to be answering more questions in this episode than usual after we get through a relatively brief recap discussion.
Well, Alan, should we get started?
Well, not so fast. First, we want to share a bit of Hobbit-related news with our listeners. One of our listeners, Trotter, a Tolkien book collector in the UK with an impressive collection, alerted us to the fact that HarperCollins has recently released a new facsimile gift edition of the first edition text of The Hobbit. So for those of you who don't already have a copy of the first edition facsimile, or like me who just kind of need to have this stuff, now is your chance to get a beautiful hardcover edition of the first edition text, which we spent a lot of time on, for example, in the 3 episodes covering Chapter 5. The set, though, and this is why I had to get it, also includes a special copy of Thror's map with secret moon runes, a CD containing recordings of Tolkien reading from The Hobbit, including some unreleased excerpts, and an illustrated booklet that includes the never-before-published lecture Dragons that Tolkien gave to some children in Oxford on New Year's Day, 1938.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Again, honestly, I was going to pass on this because I do already have the first edition facsimile. We've been using it. But after hearing about the CD and that lecture especially, I don't know. I might end up getting this one.
I think you might.
Thanks a lot, Alan.
And thank you, Trotter.
And thank you, Trotter.
Right now, this is only available in the UK, so U.S. listeners will have to order from overseas. Shipping is, not free that way often, but I think it is with a couple of places. We'll put some links up, but it seems very much worth the price and the wait. But for now, why don't we go ahead and just dive into our recap?
All right, let's do it.
As we talked about in the introduction, not counting our introductory episode, not counting this retrospective, and setting aside our special episodes, the interviews, the Q&As, we spent 29 episodes on The Hobbit.
Wow.
Now, I did a little math because you know me. I like math.
You do this kind of stuff, yet. You love data.
I do math. That's right. The average length of those episodes was 1 hour 35, with an average of 1 hour 10 being spent on chapter discussion alone. So that's 34 hours of conversation, discussion, and analysis on just 276 pages. Though I didn't take the time to remove our digressions from that calculation, but
No, that's okay. That's why we call it the Prancing Pony Podcast.
That's right. That's right. And those are going to remain consistent. So it's more like, that really tells us we are in for the long haul with the Lord of the Rings coming up. I did not want to do those projections.
You are not kidding. I mean, but it's going to be great. I mean, it's Lord of the Rings. It's just going to be such a fun journey, and we're gonna relish every moment. I mean, this is really what a lot of people are waiting for, and I think this is what we're waiting for. So we will take the time.
Absolutely. Well, early on we started talking about themes that we would notice throughout the book, and it's funny, we ended up adding 1 or 2, but at first the big 3 were luck and fate and kind of that interaction. Comfort and its opposites, discomfort or pain or stress or whatever.
Right.
And the battle between the Baggins and Took sides.
Right.
In Bilbo. So we're going to cover all of these, but we're also going to talk...
Those were the three that we knew from the beginning, knew going in.
Exactly.
We
had no idea that we were going to cover as much about dragon sickness as we did, but we'll touch on that as well as how The Hobbit fits within Tolkien's own definition of fantasy from his essay on fairy stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, that ended up being a big one.
Let's go ahead and start out with Fate.
Yeah, let's do that. I mean, we've certainly talked about it a lot, right up until the last minutes of the last chapter.
Yeah, the very last page. You're right.
Yeah. And you know, we've seen it. We've called it by many names. We've called it fate. We've called it luck. We've called it divine providence, the hand of Iluvatar. It is all of those things. And it has been a force in this book from the beginning.
Oh yeah, from the very beginning. I think we really started to see it when they got out into their journey. The first big, I mean, there were a lot of little moments. We only really thought about the big ones here for the recap, but the finding
Otherwise,
of
we will be here all day, folks.
Yeah, we would. We would be here. This would be like a 4-hour episode, and I know some of you would like that. We would not. No. I mean, really, that's just too long to sit here and talk into a microphone. It is.
Yeah, and our families wouldn't be too fond of us the next day.
No, they wouldn't, especially considering we'd be, going to bed about the time they're getting up in the morning at that point.
Yeah.
So, I think the first big example of that sort of wow luck was the finding of Glamdring, Orcrist, and the sword that would be Sting in a troll horde.
It's just called Gordon at that point.
Yeah, just Gordon. Mr. Sumner. Oh, man. That joke is never going to get old now, is it?
No, it isn't. And we've got all of Lord of the Rings to keep on.
Many more appearances of Sting.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Now the rest of the police, they're just out of luck. But anyway.
Yeah.
But there were so many more examples, weren't there, of fate, luck, divine providence?
Yeah, I mean right after that one, their arrival at Rivendell just in time.
Yeah,
exactly the right
exactly in time.
For them to read those moon runes.
You show up 3 days later and it's all over. Yeah. You're never going to get in there.
Absolutely perfect timing.
Or when they get up into the mountains and they're in the Goblin Cave and Bilbo is having that dream about the crack and wakes up just in time for Gandalf to get out. Because if Gandalf doesn't escape, they don't escape.
Yeah. Yeah, we found a few of those places where Bilbo would have these really interesting dreams, and although it's not one of the topics we're going to talk about in this episode,
no, that's true.
I would love to do a study on some of the dreams at some point, because some of them are these sort of prophetic, these
vision
dreams.
Sort of dreams.
Yeah, visions. Yeah. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
But then I think, man, if you're talking about lucky moments, you can't get much better than the finding of the ring, can you?
No, that's true. I mean, in terms of fate and the intervention of Iluvatar, that's pretty much the big one.
Yeah.
Let's revisit that, actually. I pulled a quote from Riddles in the Dark. His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even of the direction they'd been going in when he had his fall. He guessed as well as he could and crawled along for a good way, till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. Certainly it did not seem of any particular use at the moment.
There's so much there. I mean, if you read that passage closely, you realize that Bilbo's not in control. This is an Eru take the wheel moment. He's and he doesn't say that consciously, but that's cool. Thank you.
That's brilliant. I love it.
But that's really what's happening here, isn't it? I mean, he is crawling around in the dark.
Yeah.
He's just kind of
his hand could go anywhere.
His hand could go anywhere, and it just suddenly his hand met. And notice the passivity of the language.
Yeah, you're right.
He didn't reach out and touch a tiny ring of cold metal. No. His hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal.
Passive. You're right. My goodness, I can't even find a light switch in my own house at the dark.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just banging
that's
on the wall.
a place that you spend a lot of time in.
Yeah.
Because you have kids and you never leave the house. That's not a goblin tunnel.
No.
Yeah.
And I'm not, terrified and wondering, when my next meal is going to be and whether I'm going to be somebody else's next meal. He just finds this ring.
Yeah.
Finds it on the floor.
Yeah.
In a tunnel in the bottom of the mountain that he was never supposed to have gotten captured. I mean, this is that moment, isn't it? This is the crazy,
It was found
luck.
by the most unlikely person imaginable.
Oh, thank you, Kate.
But yeah, and then he put it in his pocket almost without thinking.
Yeah.
He doesn't actively think, oh, this will be useful.
My first thought would be, this is a ring. Who does it belong to? There's somebody down here? That's a
very good point. You start
I'm still
to
going to
wonder.
put it in my pocket, but I'm
get a little
wondering,
nervous. Oh, I'm not alone down here. Yeah.
rings don't just form like stalactites.
This is not a naturally occurring mountain ring.
This is not a naturally occurring.
The elusive misty mountain ring that just naturally forms deeply.
It's just, the perfect set of circumstances arrive.
Yeah.
I can see the documentary now.
Rings of the Misty Mountains.
Yeah.
These majestic rings that form mysteriously below the mountains.
Nobody knows how they happen. But, not much later, the life-saving answer in the riddle game. And even the narrator talks about that. So he calls out time. He wants to say, give me more time, but he just says, time. And the narrator says, Bilbo was saved by pure luck.
Right.
For that, of course, was the answer.
Right.
And that's the difference between Bilbo going on to save the world and Bilbo being a few lunches and leftovers for Gollum.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, the huge string of events that happens when he brings the ring back to back to the Shire.
The rest of the Legendarium, folks.
Pretty
kind
much.
of a big moment, really.
The next few years of our lives. Yeah. What happened? And not too long after that, we saw him, Chapter 8, all alone in Mirkwood, and just guessing out of pure luck the right direction
seriously,
where the dwarves
if he's
are
even
taken.
off by 5 or 10 degrees, he's never going to find them. If he's off by 2 degrees, he's never going to find them. I mean, he had to guess exactly the right direction where they were taken.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing, considering that he did that after he woke up the next morning.
Yeah.
Right? Because he decided wisely not to try to do anything at night.
Right.
Though I might have, grabbed a stick and marked in the ground an arrow pointing the direction that I think those sounds were in so that I could wake up in the morning and go, oh, that's the way.
That's a good point, yeah. But he didn't think to do any of that, yeah.
No. He just went to, decided to try to go to sleep while he could. And then the next morning wakes up and guesses the right direction.
Yeah. Amazing.
Wow. There's a hand of Iluvatar. Even the escape from the Elven King's halls, not just the escape itself, which I actually chalk up to Bilbo being a very creative thinker and a problem solver, but the fact that escape turned out to be the only way out of Mirkwood. Remember how if they had stayed on that path, it would have led to a bunch of marshes and they're dead.
True. If they had taken the path that they originally meant to take, and then then that would have been problematic, right?
Well, very problematic, the original path, yeah.
But then they ended up taking the elf road, and then, the end of that road was
just
blocked
a dead
up.
end.
Yeah.
It was a cul-de-sac.
Yeah.
It was a sackville.
It was Oh, well done.
Oh, goodness. Well, I try.
Think about just the sequence of events that allowed them to escape with the butler and, the drink,
that particular
the little drinking,
wine.
Right, the strong
drinking
wine.
game.
Yeah.
Every time Thranduil mentions his hair, take a drink.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not going to last long.
Don't do that with the strong wine, man. Do that
with
the cheap stuff. But
this is not the boxed wine. This is the serious stuff.
This is the good stuff from Dorwinian. And then what? When they get to the doorstep, there's, you probably really would consider it more fate than luck. But,
sure.
Bilbo's bad feeling on the doorstep.
Oh, yeah. And how absolutely that saved their lives. I mean, without that moment of, we've got to get in the tunnel right now. And Thorin's like, there's something in his voice that tells me I should do this. And they get inside, and seconds later, smashy smash.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's not forget the luck of arriving at the doorstep at the right time, too.
At the right time. You're not kidding.
Yeah.
I mean, if you arrive a day late, you are done.
And what did we
there
figure?
For another 79 years.
76 years before Durin's Day happens again, if our calculations are right.
Something like that.
Somewhere between 19 and 76 years. It's probably something like that.
It's a very long period of time. Bilbo finding Smaug's weak spot. If he had not been able to just keep Smaug talking for all that time and getting him to show his underbelly, he never would have known about the weak spot. And then the thrush happened to hear him telling the dwarves about it. And the thrush being able to tell Bard about it.
And Bard being able to understand. And Bard's last arrow, finding its target.
Last arrow. The last one. I mean, again.
His last arrow, the black arrow.
Yeah, a black arrow. I have saved you to the last. Bilbo stumbling in the massive hall of treasure. Bilbo at the one moment where he's by himself, because remember, the dwarves end up coming in with him later.
Right.
But that one moment that he has by himself, he stumbles across the Arkenstone.
Yeah.
Are you
because
kidding me?
Because if the dwarves come in and see that shining, they're going to know what it is immediately.
They're going to know. Yeah. And the whole plan for Bilbo later is got to be different.
Yeah. And this is a huge mound of treasure. This is a needle in a haystack moment when he finds.
I mean, it may not be as needle in a haystack as the movie indicated, where there's this, I don't know, acres and acres and acres of gold coins all piled deep.
It's a big pile. I'm sure it's a big pile. Yeah,
it's a bigger pile of money than I've ever seen.
Yeah,
I mean, that's for sure. And then, of course, just recently, the last stuff we talked about the big eucatastrophes at the end, the dual back-to-back eucatastrophes, the arrival of the goblins and the arrival of the eagles.
Yeah.
Just there's so many moments where fate, luck, Hand of Iluvatar all fit in and all guided circumstances. And yet so many of these, though, and maybe not all of them, but so many of them required some sort of individual decision-making.
Yes, exactly. And that was one of the things that we saw, that no matter how lucky you are, you have to take action.
Yeah.
In order to make good on the promise of that luck.
That's right.
And we saw this very recently with the last passage of the book. You read it at the end of the last episode.
Just last
the end
week,
of our discussion. Yeah. I'll read it here. It says,
"Oh, now you get to read it." Aha,
yeah,
I like that. Well done. I see what you did there, Sean. I wanted the last sentence in the book.
I need
to get it one way or another.
Yeah, I'm sure you did it better, but here I'll go ahead.
No.
Then the prophecies of the old songs have turned out to be true after a fashion, said Bilbo. Of course, said Gandalf. And why should they not prove true? Surely you don't disbelieve the prophecies because you had a hand in bringing them about yourself. You don't really suppose, do you, that all your adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck, just for your sole benefit? You are a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I am very fond of you. But you are only quite a little fellow in a wide world, after all.
I love that. And yeah, that's just
another
reminder.
And so we talked about that, how,
you had a hand in bringing them about yourself.
Exactly. And as we talked about last time, those prophecies were fulfilled the only way that they could be fulfilled, the way that they were fated to be fulfilled, the way that Iluvatar had in mind all along. But it still required Bilbo to take
in fairness, action. I think even if something, let's say, for example, let's take one of these things. Let's take the finding of the Ark and Stones. We just talked about that a minute ago. Let's assume Bilbo doesn't find that and Thorin does. Okay. We can't imagine necessarily what the end would be, but the concept that is that Iluvatar would still have worked that to accomplish his will somehow.
Well, that's a good point. The whole, shall prove but mine instrument. Yeah. Ultimately, what is planned, what is fated, is going to happen.
Right. Yeah. The end result is going to occur.
Yeah, that's fair.
And it's fair to say that some of the steps were certain steps that Iluvatar had already decreed. And some of them were things that were depending on others. And the thing is, we don't know because we're in it. We're in this timeline. We don't know what might have happened or what could have happened. We only know what did happen. And therefore, from our perspective, what you said is totally true. It had to happen this way.
It's more of that Boethian, Yeah. Interesting.
It is hard to kind of wrap your head around it.
It is, yeah. No, but that's a good point. So yeah, there could be other ways, but I mean, I do feel
we just don't know what they are.
Right. And I feel like the fact that Bilbo had a hand, I guess the point is that the fact that Bilbo had a hand in doing this, in doing something to bring this stuff about, doesn't negate the fact that it was fate. Doesn't negate the fact that it was meant to be.
That it was all coordinated and orchestrated by Iluvatar to accomplish a particular goal.
And I think we have to contrast that with the sort of the passive attitude of the Lake Towners, which is always just, we saw this with their songs back in the Warm Welcome chapter, where it's just like, well, there's a prophecy, so this is going to happen. They're so passive, they don't take any active role in making things happen.
They don't see themselves as being a part of the accomplishment of the prophecy. They just expect the prophecy to be fulfilled. Yeah. Very, very, like you said, very passive, very hands off, and not seeing themselves as active members.
Active participants in.
Right.
Yeah. In what's going to happen.
And that's great stuff. That theme was so much fun to look at as we went through the text, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was. Once you start looking for it, you realize
it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. We
only talked there about the major moments, and there were at least a dozen of those. But if we wanted to itemize the whole thing, we could be here for hours just on this one topic. There are so many moments.
Yeah,
great stuff.
It was a very cool theme.
Well, probably the major theme that everybody sees right away is the Baggins versus Took. So let's go ahead and move on to that. We'll start maybe with I've kind of put together a little bit of a definition of the two. I think you've got one later that you've put together as well.
Yeah.
For me, the words that come to mind when I think Baggins for Bilbo, prose, and you'll see that that's just, as a counter to poetry, structure, food, comfort.
Yeah.
Comfort, which is interesting because we get that as a separate theme. Provincial, both in good and bad ways.
Yeah.
And a homebody. Whereas the Took is, of course, more poetic. He's a little more flexible, adventurous, more of a risk taker, more of an explorer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
We really do see that conflict between them. Not so much conflict, but
there's
push
a constant
and pull.
push-pull.
Yeah.
There's definitely a push-pull, and we've seen Bilbo sort of oscillate between these two sides, be way too Bagginsy, or way too Bagginsy, or way too Tookish, and we eventually, he eventually achieved a kind of balance. But I think so many of those moments where you see him at his most Bagginsy or his most Tookish are some of the most memorable moments in the story.
They are.
Don't you think?
Yeah, well, that's where the character comes out the most. Where the strength of the writing and the strength of the character, they just jump off the page. Let's look at probably his most Bagginsy is chapter 1, right? An unexpected party. I love the transition.
So that makes sense. Yeah.
He goes from he had become uncomfortable, then he was flustered, and then he moves to bewildered and beweathered, and then positively flummoxed. On this most awkward Wednesday.
Yep.
I love that. Absolutely love that.
And such great language that Tolkien uses for, he uses these very, they're these very English words, very...
or made up words. Was beweathered a real word?
Beweathered might have been made up. I know confusticate and bebother were some of his...
That's right.
Some of his made up ones. But
I loved flummoxed.
Flummoxed, yeah, exactly. These are very earthy words,
Yes, they are. And, let's see, I don't know if there are any in this passage, but I pulled a small section from that chapter because I think it shows us it shows him, I should say, at his most Bagginsy. Poor Bilbo couldn't bear it any longer. At may never return, he began to feel a shriek coming up inside, and very soon it burst out like the whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. All the dwarves sprang up, knocking over the table. Gandalf struck a blue light on the end of his magic staff, and in its firework glare, the poor little hobbit could be seen kneeling on the hearthrug, shaking like a jelly that was melting. Then he fell flat on the floor and kept on calling out, struck by lightning, over and over again, and that was all they could get out of him for a long time.
I love that.
So they took him and laid him out of the way on the drawing room sofa, the drink at his elbow, and they went back to their dark business. "Excitable little fellow," said Gandalf, as they sat down again. "Gets funny queer fits, but he is one of the best. One of the best. As fierce as a dragon in a pinch." Which, of course,
at which point all the dwarves are thinking, really? Him?
Yeah, you can hear the eye rolls from here.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. Struck by lightning. It's such a great moment.
That is a brilliant moment.
It is so Bagginsy because he just has this little outburst of this is such a shakeup to his everything, his way of life, and he just can't believe these dwarves are here and that they want him for this mission quest thing.
Well done.
Thank you.
See what you did there. But even then, even after all of that, the Took side got stirred by the dwarves singing, didn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really probably the first time we really saw it.
I
take that
Certainly
back. We did see it.
explicitly.
We saw it earlier when he was talking about wasn't it when he was talking about Gandalf's fireworks and the text said he wasn't nearly as prosy as he liked to believe. There was a bit of Tookishness coming out then. Yeah.
Yep. As well as in the conversation the night before when he decided, grocer, not a burglar line, and he was like,
that's right. Yeah.
He got so offended by that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was the Took
side. And that was one of the things that really kind of, made him want to prove himself. He didn't want to be, he wanted to be thought fierce.
He even did. He's like, you're at the wrong door. But you know what?
Right.
Treat it as the right one. I'm gonna do this.
Right.
And then he finds out what's involved and he's like,
Yeah. So what else? We've got the roast mutton chapter. So, when Bilbo wakes up, and the dwarves have left, he's relieved
Yeah.
But he is also a trifle disappointed. And that feeling surprises him because he kind of realizes he may have missed out on this adventure.
Yeah, but of course he then chastises himself for even thinking about
it. Right. The Baggins came back pretty quickly.
Yeah, the Baggins did come back very quickly in that moment.
But then later on in that same chapter, the Took came back in spades, didn't it? When he,
oh yeah,
in the encounter with the trolls, he got so confident in his stealthiness.
Too confident. That was an example of too much Took, huh?
Exactly. Yep.
Because picking that troll's pocket might have been a step too far.
It could have ended that adventure very quickly.
Very, very quickly.
Who knew that the troll had the
troll's purses are the mischief.
The car alarm on his purse.
The car alarm.
Yeah, who are you?
And you can see William now just, beep, beep.
Yeah. Yep.
I got my purse locked up, and it's all good now. Beep, beep.
Yep. And then you talk about too Tookish. I mean, I would say Bilbo at his most Tookish. I know I'm skipping ahead a little bit here just in the interest of time because we will be here all night. But just, the inside information chapter when he's riddling with Smaug and, he's kind of gradually escalating and then he gets to this point where he pushes it too far, with his little, and so do burglars. And I've actually got some of those passages here. I'll read a few sentences and we'll just kind of watch the progression. These sentences come like sort of over the course of the chapter. But so the first passage I've got here is, "Dear me, what a fool I was and am," said the least Tookish part of him. "I have absolutely no use for dragon-guarded treasures." And that's when he's actually coming into the mountain for the first time.
Yeah.
He gets there, he finds the cup, and then he returns with it, and then eventually he goes back into the dragon's hoard, and that's when he starts the riddling. And he starts with things like, "I am ring winner and luck wearer, and I am barrel rider," went on Bilbo, beginning to be pleased with his riddling.
Beginning to be pleased. There's your dangerous moment.
You're starting to get in the danger zone, and then you get on to him actually really kind of taunting Smaug a little bit with, "That gold was only an afterthought with us. We came over hill and under hill, by wave and wind, for revenge." And then the last moment, he's kind of had his last little bit, and then ponies take some catching, I believe, after a long start, and so do burglars. He added as a parting shot as he darted back and fled up the tunnel. Yeah, that's way too much. That was over mode. That was overly Tookish. And he almost got singed for it.
Well, he did get singed. He almost got completely crispified.
He almost got completely destroyed. He almost got burninated for it.
Burninated.
See, we knew we'd come back to that.
Oh, man, that was such an awesome moment. You just draw an S, and you draw another S.
Amazing. Can't believe what I missed out on.
It was a wingling dragon. Anyway. Sorry. And I know like you said, we skipped a bunch for good reason because we got so much to do. But there are so many moments like that where he goes kind of full Took, if you will, and he just overdoes it. Where he gets himself in very dangerous situations. Yeah. Because of his Took side, and other times where he just sits there, a little bit too scared. Now, most of those are early on.
True. And that's the thing is that we find as the story goes on that neither side is better than the other. They
both have their pros and cons. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think we talked about this a few episodes ago. You kind of start out thinking, the Baggins moments or, where he's weaker, where, he needs to change. He needs to be more Tookish. But it's really not as simple as that. He really needs to find a balance because each do have their strengths and weaknesses. I mean,
absolutely.
The Baggins is careful. The Baggins pays attention to details, tries to make things right.
He catches all those things. You're right.
Yeah.
He's the only one who happened to listen to, excuse me, we're standing out here by the door. Does anybody remember what Elrond said?
Right, exactly. And I think the Baggins is the part of him that tries to make things right, like the whole episode with the Arkenstone.
Oh, yeah.
Now, of course, it was very Tookish of him to go out there and actually, deliver it to the opposing side.
But it was Baggins for him to make sure that Bomber didn't take a blame for it, to make sure that, everything was kind of handled in terms, and that he would go back. Yeah. Because Bagginsy, it was Tookish too in terms of having the courage to do it.
Having the courage to go back and face up to what he did. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But the Baggins also values home and hobbity things. And I think we've seen how that is well, we'll talk about this in a little bit. That is kind of
Mhm.
what prevents him from being bewitched by
Yeah,
the
you're
dragon's
right.
horde, by the dragon sickness.
Absolutely. That ends up probably being his biggest defense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Took side is bold, it's creative, it's adventurous. I think we talked about that earlier. It values sort of the unexpected, the fairy things, the elf things.
Yeah.
But it is a risk. It's a risk-taking side, and
Yeah.
sometimes taking care is more important. And so
Yeah.
the Baggins side is a useful thing to have.
Right.
But
We all need
one-
both, I think. That's kind of one of the messages of the book, I think.
You're right. I think you're absolutely right. I wish we had time, and maybe at some point for a pondering down the road, I'll do this, but I wonder how many of these crucial Baggins Took moments coincided with moments of fate or luck and the necessity to act. I'll have to look. I'll have to really, really do a deep study
That
on that.
would be
I
interesting to see, like,
Yeah.
when he did have to take some action, which side of
Yeah.
him was it that was probably kind of, taking the wheel at that point?
think. Right.
Was it more of a Bagginsy action or a Tookish action? That would be an interesting study.
It would be. It would be. And to see if that changes over time. Like at the beginning,
Yeah.
my recollection is that all the action moments were Took moments. That
Right.
he had to step forward and do something about the trolls, that he had to deal with Gollum in the riddle game. But I'm not sure that stayed that way. I'm not sure.
I think
I'll have to take a look.
right. That's very interesting. Well, and again, I think, we come to that eventual blending, the blended in measure.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking as well. Thorin's dying words and talking about essentially how you've got these things blended in measure. So it's a perfect blend.
Yeah. And I think my favorite depiction of that was the moment in chapter 16, A Thief in the Night, when he's there in with Bard and the Elven King, and he's delivering the Arkenstone. So I'll read this passage real quickly here. It says,
Okay.
Bilbo was sitting beside a warm fire in front of a large tent, and there sat two, gazing curiously at him, both the Elven King and Bard. A hobbit in elvish armor, partly wrapped in an old blanket, was something new to them. Really, Bilbo was saying in his best business manner, things are impossible. Personally, I am tired of the whole affair. I wish I was back in the West, in my own home, where folk are more reasonable. But I have an interest in this matter, 1/14 share to be precise, according to a letter, which fortunately I believe I have kept. He drew from a pocket in his old jacket, which he still wore over his mail, crumpled and much folded, Thorin's letter that had been put under the clock on his mantelpiece in May.
April. Sorry. I know.
Professor. But yeah, I mean, you really see both sides of him there. I mean, Hobbit
really
in elvish
do.
armor is very Tookish, but then partially wrapped in an old blanket because he's cold, because he had to ford the river.
In the best business manner.
that's
Really,
Bagginsy.
things
And
are impossible. That's
yeah,
such a Bagginsy thing.
Such a Bagginsy bit of dialogue.
Just remembering the letter and pulling it out.
And
The fact
having
that he
it,
kept it as a Bagginsy thing.
and I think also just the visual image of him having the letter in his jacket pocket, which is over his mail.
Yes.
Just what he's wearing, his wardrobe right now is actually Baggins and Took combined. It's got his old
It's this
jacket.
beautiful contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of those moments too. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about doing this season is really getting a chance to experience The Hobbit in a way that I don't think I ever have. In fact, I know I haven't, but I mean,
I agree. Yeah.
It's been just so eye-opening. And I think it's going to help us when we get to The Lord of the Rings to really have this experience and this walkthrough. So glad we've been able to do that.
I've never read this book this closely, and I've never found so much to love about it. And it's great.
It really has been. And one of the other big themes, the one that I think from the very beginning was one we talked about we'd be looking for, was comfort. Comfort and its synonyms versus discomfort and its synonyms.
Yeah.
Or even just scenes that described comfort versus scenes that described discomfort and things like that.
Yeah, and that is tied, to some extent with the Baggins side of things. It's tied into the importance of the concept of home and all the things he's missing when he's off on this very Tookish adventure.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth looking at as a theme in its own right, especially because of how much this word comfort, and as you said, its synonyms versus discomfort and its synonyms, just how often these words appear in the text.
Well, and they even start from the very beginning. I mean, I'm going to go back and read. I love this. It feels like so long ago that I read this the first time, but I'm going to read it again. The very introduction, that in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel, a very comfortable tunnel, without smoke, with paneled walls, and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats.
Wow. So in that passage, you've got not only the word comfort appearing twice. That means comfort, and then a very comfortable tunnel. But then all these images of comfort with the paneled walls and the carpeted floors, some tiled, some carpeted. Polished chairs, pegs for hats and coats. It feels homey. You really see the trappings of a comfortable suburban home here.
Absolutely. Even in the description of what it's not, that it's not dry, bare, and sandy with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat.
Right.
So in other words, we know that there's plenty of places to sit down and plenty of things to eat.
Right.
None of which are the ends of worms, by the way.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, the idea that he took comfort in just not looking like a dwarf when he left.
Oh, yeah. When they left, when they were leaving town, and he had to wear Dwalin's old, I think it was Dwalin's
hood,
old overcoat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hood.
Yeah. And he was just happy to have that part of himself. He took comfort in retaining his Hobbit identity.
Mm-hmm.
I guess this is really discomfort when they lost their food in the river when it rained. Before they reached the Trollshaws.
That's right. The ponies got in, and they were able to get the ponies back, but the bags had been taken off, and the food was gone, and they were going to have. I think they had very little dinner and even less breakfast or something like that. Was the text.
Yeah.
But then soon after discomfort there.
Yeah. And then soon after that, they found themselves in Rivendell. There was a comfortable feeling in the twilight there.
Yes. That's true.
That sort of the rest and happiness that they find in those elvish places.
Yeah. And then, of course, some more of the uncomfortable situations. You get when he's confronted by Thorin over the Arkenstone, and, it's described as very uncomfortable. I think even the battle was described as very uncomfortable, which is kind of an understatement. But
I think I love that sometimes, we've talked about the way that Tolkien in some places kind of sanitized the language a little bit for children. And I think sometimes uncomfortable is a euphemism for foolishly dangerous and potentially life-threatening.
Yeah, and even that's a bit of a euphemism. It's more like uncomfortable as a euphemism for, I'm not sure they're going to make it out of this.
You are going to die. Yeah, I mean, one of those, since we haven't talked about this chapter too much yet, Chapter 9, Barrels Out of Bond. So Bilbo is floating on top of a barrel, or trying to stay on top of the barrel. While the barrels float down. Before long, the barrels broke free again and turned and twisted off down the stream and out into the main current. Then he found it quite as difficult to stick on as he had feared, but he managed it somehow, though it was miserably uncomfortable.
There you go.
Luckily, he was very light, and the barrel was a good big one, and being rather leaky, had now shipped a small amount of water. I'll stop there, but I mean, obviously, the word you're looking for isn't just miserably uncomfortable, but you're going to drown. I mean, that's what's happening there. You are going to die, Mr. Baggins.
Oh, man.
But hey, look, we've also got luck there. Luckily, he was very light, and the barrel had shipped some water. So
yeah, I think there were a lot of moments of luck and fate in dealing with the comfort. There's a lot of crossover in these themes. I shouldn't say crossover per se, but two themes happening at the same time.
Sure, yeah. They all work together.
Doubt. They really do.
Well, and then we also had some symbols of comfort too. I mean, I think the one that strikes me, because we talked about it again, I think in the last episode.
Oh yeah, because
the pocket handkerchief.
It came up again because he ran out and had to borrow one of Elrond's.
Right. Which I love that Elrond had. Was it a red handkerchief?
Red silk handkerchief.
Yeah.
I don't know where he ordered it. I mean, does he get the Land's End catalog? I don't know. I mean,
probably.
What's delivery time for him? He's
Well, it is the last homely house, so it's probably going to take a long time.
That's true. UPS is the only one who delivers there, and they charge a fortune.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, from the very beginning, Bilbo left Bag End without a pocket handkerchief, and he was very puffed, was the description of that.
Very puffed he was.
And then Gandalf, kind of bails him out. Gandalf brings a lot of handkerchiefs, and that's actually the last we hear of them until...
That's true.
They come up again right before he walks into Smaug's lair, but it's only to show how far he's come, because it says he had not had a pocket handkerchief for ages.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
And then again later on with, when he borrows Elrond's at the end. So they come up
Yeah.
at the beginning as these symbols of comfort, and then they come
And
up
then
at
they're
the
reminded
end
at the end,
as a reminder of he doesn't have these things anymore. He doesn't.
Yeah.
And he's kind of forgotten about them.
No,
I mean,
it's
I'm
true.
sure he hasn't quite forgotten, but he's learned to live without them.
That's exactly what it is. One thing that he did struggle living without, though, was bacon and eggs.
Well,
we see
with
this a
good
lot,
reason.
don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, okay, mostly bacon, but it's a thought he seems to turn to frequently when he's in trouble, isn't it? I was looking through these. We got Chapter 5, he's alone in the dark before meeting Gollum, and he's thinking about bacon. Chapter 8, alone again in the dark of Mirkwood. He's about to encounter the spiders at that point, and he's thinking about bacon and eggs. And then Chapter 16, he literally is dreaming of eggs and bacon after he's given the Arkenstone to Bard.
Right.
I'm half surprised that at the very end that he handed Gandalf the tobacco jar. I'm almost surprised he didn't hand him.
And then he reached for the bacon.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. and offered to share some
Gandalf,
bacon
hold the
with
tobacco.
Gandalf.
I'm going to get some more bacon.
Yeah. Oh man, that's
hold my
awesome.
pipe, weed, Gandalf.
That's right. I must get bacon.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe a few eggs, but mostly bacon.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, this notion of comfort is so pervasive through the whole text, like you said, and it seems
kind of
like
in many places it is what's keeping him going. Is
exactly,
the
especially
thoughts
early
of that
on.
comfort. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially early on, and though he sort of gets accustomed to the idea of living without those comforts, he always does seem to miss them every time. Even when the Took side is out, even when he's done something really brave, there's oftentimes these moments, these reminders of the importance of home, the importance of comfort, the importance of food. And, and then we start to see more of that as he comes back. And it's that thematic idea of he grows and gets this balance right. And then he comes back to home and the comfort of home. Yeah.
There and back again.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yep. And I think that's why
stuff.
that last scene that we talked about last time is so poetic, because it ends
so
with
beautiful.
Such a comfortable moment
nice little
with his
homey
friends.
thing. Just a laugh with his friends and hands him the tobacco jar.
Yep.
It's just full of awesome. It really is.
Yep. All right. So I think that's comfort. What's next on our list? I think we've got greed up next.
Well, yeah, greed. I mean, this is something that I don't think we thought of as a theme starting out. And it is because it's really only a theme for about a 4 or 5 chapter.
Sort of a third of the book, yeah.
Yeah, sort of that later third. Now, we call it greed, but you might also call it dragon sickness, even though that term is only used once.
Only
in
used
chapter
once
19,
at the very end of the book.
At the very end.
The last page of my edition.
That's correct. But the best description of it is actually all the way back in chapter 15. This is back when Bard had listed his demands, right? Dragon Slayer, some of that treasure is mine. And, by the way, we've all lost our town and, like a quarter of our people are dead. And could you please give us a little help?
Right.
Well, so now we pick up from all that. Now, these were fair words and true, if proudly and grimly spoken. And Bilbo thought that Thorin would at once admit what justice was in them. He did not, of course, expect that anyone would remember that it was he who discovered all by himself the dragon's weak spot. And that was just as well, for no one ever did. But also, he did not reckon with the power that gold has upon which a dragon has long brooded, nor with dwarvish hearts.
Yeah, and we talked about, how even in the last episode, we talked about how that dragon sickness ultimately got the master. I think I said, I thought that was kind of a joking reference to it at the end, but I think you're right. I think it probably was more serious than that. I think it was the master was just more susceptible to it.
Yeah.
And
a greedy person is going to naturally struggle more with that, right? Yeah.
And I think we see so many examples of different characters succumbing to the dragon sickness. I actually want to start with a character who doesn't succumb to it so much as he embodies it, and that's Smaug.
That's true. He's not dragon sick. He's just a dragon.
Right. But I like this because this is something that we can use to compare the other occurrences to.
Oh, yeah,
And
absolutely.
this comes from chapter 12, again, Inside Information.
Okay.
And this is right after Bilbo has stolen the cup.
Mm-hmm.
He stirred and stretched forth his neck to sniff. Then he missed the cup. Thieves, fire, murder. Such a thing had not happened since first he came to the mountain. His rage passes description. The sort of rage that is only seen when rich folk that have more than they can enjoy suddenly lose something that they have long had, but have never before used or wanted. His fire belched forth. The hall smoked. He shook the mountain roots. He thrust his head in vain at the little hole, and then coiling his length together, roaring like thunder underground, he sped from his deep lair through its great door, out into the huge passages of the mountain palace, and up towards the front gate.
I love that.
I love that, rich folk who have more than they can enjoy suddenly lose something that they've long had but never before. And the rage that he goes into for that. Yeah. And that is sort of the textbook example of dragon sickness. And I think that's the light in which Tolkien wants us to view Thorin's downward spiral. And we talked about how Thorin's downward spiral echoes, those four sins of Melkor.
Right.
But I think all the different examples of dragon sickness, I think, are defined by this moment of Smaug.
Yeah, I think you're right. This is the baseline. This is what dragon sickness looks like. It looks like a good way of saying it. Yeah. Dramatic overreaction to the loss of a material object, rage that is beyond what would make sense.
Yeah.
And then the desire to seek revenge. I mean, I'm reminded of Thorin, immediately saying, I will be avenged upon anyone who finds this, doesn't immediately give it up.
Yeah. Well, and even Bard. I mean, although Bard is generally, we've generally considered Bard one of the more noble characters in the book, but we saw how ready he was to march into battle and start killing.
That's right.
Let us set on them now from both sides before they are fully rested.
Yeah.
He was ticked off at I think
his messengers
Thorin
got
shooting
shot
at his men. But he's also just like, he's ready to just go ahead and start this war for gold.
That's right. Get this going, which is something the Elven King is not quite willing to do. I mean,
he
may say, long will I tarry ere I begin this war for gold, and that's good. And we applaud him for that and point out that vast difference between book Thranduil and movie Thranduil.
Mm-hmm.
But let's not forget that the Elven King's weakness for treasure, I mean, there's a little dragon sickness there too. He's always comparing his hoard to those of previous kings. And it is this desire for more treasure that sends him to the mountain with many spearmen and bowmen. And Bard's kind of like,
you are right about that. I mean, I like to focus on the long will I tarry line because he does end up doing the right thing. But you're right. He starts out with the worst intentions.
Yeah, he's a scavenger. He's going to come and take what treasure he can find.
Yeah. And I think the other thing we see is, we see the antidote to greed and dragon sickness. We definitely sort of the simple hobbitishness of Bilbo. And yes, I think we should make that a word, hobbitishness.
I think we should. And it's definitely kind of the Bagginsy part of it, the homey part. It's that what's sort of looking for, contentment. And in fact, it's the opposite of greed. We talked about this last episode that he gave stuff away because that's just who he is. Mm-hmm. And here's a quote from
He
chapter
didn't even
13.
want 2 chests of gold. He took a chest of gold and a chest of silver. He was so not greedy.
Bilbo, 2 chests, Baggins.
That's right. No one ever talks about the quest. Everyone always wants to talk about the chests.
The chests. Oh, folks, if you have not seen
Arthur Two
Sheds Jackson, you need to do that. Find that. It's hilarious. So here's a quote from chapter 13 before we get too sidetracked that kind of reminds us of what that antidote to dragon sickness looks like. All the same, Mr. Baggins kept his head more clear of the bewitchment of the hoard than the dwarves did. Long before the dwarves were tired of examining the treasures, he became weary of it and sat down on the floor, and he began to wonder nervously what the end of it all would be. I would give a good many of these precious goblets, he thought, for a drink of something cheering out of one of Beorn's wooden bowls. And that's it. That's simple.
That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. Meet your basic needs. I don't need the gold.
Yep.
That's what the antidote is.
Mm-hmm. And I think, and that's what Thorin realized on his deathbed.
Oh, yeah.
When he says to Bilbo, if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world.
And see, you got that line too.
I
see what you did there.
You see what I did? Yeah. See?
I do. No, that was
ulterior motives.
I mean, it's worth discussing. It's absolutely worth pointing out. Yeah, that is the antidote to dragon sickness, is recognizing the value of these simple, free, homey things, food and cheer and song, friendship, even though that's not specifically mentioned there, but just those basics. That's what you need.
Those things that really matter.
Yeah.
And I think that is another lesson of this book. And although I don't have the passage in front of me and I don't want to take the time to look for it, I think if we were to go back and look at the first few pages of The Hobbit where he's talking about the things that hobbits value and describing hobbits, I think if we were to take that and then compare it with some of the stuff we're talking about here, I think we'd find a really strong contrast there.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Well, the last thing we want to talk about, now that we've talked about some of those big themes, is kind of how this all fits into Tolkien's own concept of fairy story, the fairy story elements. And for that, we're going to start with a quote from On Fairy Stories, which we talked about all the way back in episode 1. Man, that was a long time ago.
Yes, it was.
And here's that passage. Fairy stories are not in normal English usage stories about fairies or elves, but stories about fairy. That is, fairy, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted.
That does kind of say it all, really.
It does.
And we talked back in that first episode about the fact that fairy is a realm or a state, like you said in that quote. It is a place.
Yes.
And it's a place that Tolkien also calls the perilous realm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important because as you mentioned in that passage you just quoted, it's not all just tra-la-la-lally and, elves roasting meat out in the woods.
There you go.
There are trolls and goblins and wargs and dragons and also really awful people too.
And bats.
And bats.
Yeah.
But it is, I think, one of the things that Tolkien talked about a lot that I'm just thinking of is, the idea of a secondary world. And this, obviously, The Hobbit takes place within a secondary world. It's got that arresting strangeness that Tolkien talked about.
Great phrase, yeah.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that is that not only is the world of The Hobbit arrestingly strange to us, but the world beyond his doors is strange even to Bilbo.
Yeah,
and we see Bilbo thrown into that.
Mm-hmm. We really do. I think one of the coolest things about fairy in this is what Tolkien talked about in On Fairy Stories, the notion of the eucatastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it because it was just 2 episodes ago.
Yeah.
Go back to that episode
we defined
if you have questions about what it is, what it looks like. But what he says and what he then demonstrates in his own work is that the eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. That's why those moments have such impact for us at the end of The Hobbit and also obviously at the end of The Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Eucatastrophe, and we're going to spend some more time talking about that soon, I think, it's a concept that if you don't have a real firm grasp on it, take some time to get one because it really shapes how you understand and absorb Tolkien's stories.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely worth reading On Fairy Stories. Read it again if you've read it before.
Yeah.
And if you haven't read it before, go out and get it's in a number of different collections and volumes, so it's easy to find.
It is. It's a lot of places.
Yeah, but find it and read it, and even read some things like maybe Corey Olsen's book on The Hobbit that kind of talks about the ways that eucatastrophe plays out, and we've talked.
Yeah, there's
about
a couple
it too.
chapters where he talks specifically about eucatastrophe.
Yeah, and we've talked about it, especially recently.
And there's a chapter in Flieger's Splintered Light on eucatastrophe that's worth reading as well.
That's right.
In fact, very, very much so.
Yeah. So there's a lot of and you're absolutely right. We're going to be talking a lot about that. It is one of the fundamental concepts of Tolkien's idea of what fantasy is and what fantasy does.
Yeah.
But we also talked about the way that fairy is present in the story of The Hobbit just through some of like the bones, some of the sources that Tolkien was referencing. Some of those
the
folklore elements. Yeah, we talked about things like the enchanted stream and the white deer. I don't know what else.
The hunt. Yeah, that's right.
The hunt in Mirkwood. I mean, honestly, Mirkwood itself, I guess, really.
Yeah, you're right. They kind
one.
of almost an enchanted forest in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think and really, I would say Bilbo's journey in general. Fairy does have sort of a real existence in places like Mirkwood and Rivendell, but I think Bilbo's story is just generally a fairy story because of his contact with all these fairy elements.
Yeah.
We talked about how crossing the Misty Mountains is sort of a boundary. We talked about things
there is that boundary of the wild, right before they get to Rivendell.
That's right.
The ford of the river.
There is a lot of that boundary crossing language throughout the book. We even talked about, funny things like the talking animals in Beorn's Hall.
In Beorn's Hall, right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, even Beorn himself, I mean, that's not necessarily fairy, but it's another folklore element.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's true. Yeah, the
this
shapeshifter.
notion of a shapeshifter, the bear thing. Yeah, we talked all about those sources of inspiration. Yeah.
Yeah. And there are this thing, we even talked about things like those green sun moments, Bard understanding the thrush,
you're never gonna let that go, are you? Never gonna let that go.
It's one of the few times that you actually admitted you were wrong about something. I have to.
Yeah, I know.
I have to go with that. It's one of the rare times I was right. But
wait a minute. I think that calls for.
No, you're right. Fine. Yeah, you're right. That was me before I realized how right I was about that.
I know. That's correct. What you should have said is, "You're wrong. You're wrong. You're really wrong.
You're wrong."
Oh goodness.
But yeah, and then ultimately, Bilbo comes back from all this changed from his experience, and we talked about this last time. Bilbo is now an elf friend, and the text tells us that he remained an elf friend.
That's huge. Yeah.
And I love this term elf friend because this is something that I was just going back. You mentioned Verlyn Flieger's Splintered Light a moment ago.
Right.
I was just going back and reading her book, A Question of Time, which has a lot of really interesting, really deep stuff in it.
I'm sorry, as a Depeche Mode fan, I keep thinking about, A Question of Time and A Question of Lust. And I'm like, wait. I keep hearing the song. Yeah.
That's why I've had Depeche Mode in my head for the last week or so, I think.
There you go.
Because
it's
I've had
a question
Depeche Mode
of time.
Yeah, that must be it. But she has a little thing about this.
I got to get to you first. Anyway, sorry.
That's great. It's been too long since we had
my best Gahan impression there.
It was a long time ago we had some Depeche Mode episodes.
Oh, yeah. People are people at the end of
I think we did like 4 of them in a row at the end of
we did.
Silmarillion.
Yeah.
But Professor Flieger had this little thing to say about the epithet elf friend. She says, it became one of the most recurrent elements in the mythology. She called it the emblem and embodiment of some of Tolkien's most deeply rooted attitudes towards myth, language, and history. And
embodiment. Boy, that is so true.
Yeah. And this is who Bilbo becomes as a result of his journey. He becomes this embodiment of myth and language and history. That's what it means to be an elf friend, is to have touched, to have touched fairy and to have come back with this awareness of myth and language and history. And
which once again makes me think of Smith of Wooten Major again.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which we
absolutely.
need to get into.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
Very cool stuff.
It is. Well, then, why don't we go ahead and get on with Barliman's Bag? It's an extended bag segment tonight. I mean, very extended.
Very much so.
Our first question is from Kieran in Liverpool. What's the deal with surnames in the Legendarium? It occurred to Kieran that only hobbits have surnames, with some exceptions, such as Tom Bombadil and Barliman Butterbur. Most of the other names are just a first name with a nickname after it, like Oakenshield, or are things like Aragorn, son of Arathorn. Now, Kieran's theory is that these surnames are only used around a certain area. The hobbits, Barliman, and Tom all live not too far away from each other in the grand scope of things. But Kieran's fiance's theory is that surnames were not really used in the older days in real life. And since hobbits haven't been around as long as men, elves, and wingless Balrogs. So there's a nice touch.
That's a nice touch.
That really is, isn't it? I'm sure now he knew how to get his question answered, I'm thinking.
Yeah, he knew how to win us over.
He really did. Now, Kieran also thought maybe it's a matter of putting emphasis on certain characters, but then given the fact that it's hobbits and such who have them, well, it just doesn't seem to make quite as much sense. But he finishes by saying, anyway, I'm looking forward to what you guys think about this, and you may be able to resolve a domestic dispute. No pressure, Sean.
Yeah, no, not at all. Thanks for putting this on us, Kieran. No, I have to say, Kieran, I'm sorry. I think I mostly side with your fiance on this one, but hear me out, all right?
Yeah.
I believe it all has to do with what the hobbits represent. And to some extent, the men who live near them, like Brelanders, Barliman and Buttimer and Bill Ferny and
Bill Ferny,
like
yeah.
Yeah. So a little word nerdery here. Surnames as family names, something that's passed on from generation to generation, and everybody in the family has the same last name. That's a pretty recent concept, historically speaking.
That's true, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think they became popular in England around 1300, 1400, right near the end of the Middle Ages. Before that, you'd find famous people or infamous people having epithets, like the nicknames that Kieran's talking about, Ragnar Lothbrok or the Venerable Bede or Richard the Lionheart, things like that. But in most cases, those names weren't passed on to their children. And I think the reason Tolkien gives hobbits and Brelanders surnames in the way we think of it is to make them look more modern to us. And I think what that does, it kind of establishes a connection between us and them. It kind of helps us relate to them. And I think, by contrast, I think it also makes the rest of Middle-earth seem a little bit more distant, maybe a bit more of that arresting strangeness we were talking about, as it must to the hobbits. So you can think of the hobbits and Brelanders as being more like ordinary folk, like you and me. Well, not that we're ordinary. We're actually probably pretty strange by most standards. But
Yes,
hobbits
we
are. They're pretty normal. They work in the fields. They go to birthday parties. They hang out at the pub. And then on the other side, you have these high mythical characters like Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and Éowyn, daughter of Éomund, and, all these others who have noble lineage and fight in these great battles. I think Aragorn and these others represent an earlier kind of a heroic or medieval concept, and their names reflect that, whereas the hobbits and the Brelanders just have ordinary folk names, and they have surnames because they're ordinary folk.
Right.
Now, that's to say nothing of Tom Bombadil, who I think he probably just came up with some gibberish that he liked the sound of. And
Tom Bombadil already existed, and he just had to find a way to shove him into his story. I mean, he said
that's the out-of-universe explanation for it, I guess.
Yeah.
But I would say, going back to Kieran's last point about putting emphasis on certain characters, I think that does make a little bit of sense. I think it's not
in the reverse, right, or in the converse. Yeah.
Exactly, because I think it's not the characters who have the surnames who are emphasized; it's the ones who don't.
Right.
So it's the Aragorns
son
and the
of
Éowyn's. They're emphasized as being different because they don't
Farmer
have
Cotton.
surnames.
Right.
Exactly. So anyway, Kieran, I hope that last point at least allows you to lay some claim to being partly right and keep the peace at home.
Keeping the peace at home. Well, the rest is up to you, though, Kieran. So we're not going to help you out with that.
That's right. Hopefully we could help a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to our next question, which comes from Melanie in San Francisco. And she says, are there any set rules or guidelines for when Bilbo is called Mr. Baggins versus Little Bilbo versus Bilbo versus the burglar, and so on? Melanie basically thinks that Bilbo might be called Mr. Baggins when he best blends the Baggins and Took sides of himself. As someone who engages with adventure, a little bit of excitement, but who wouldn't abandon or leave his friends in times of trouble, but who also knows the value of food and a warm home.
Yeah.
Another way to put it, she says, would be that he is called Mr. Baggins when he acts how Gandalf sees him to be, if that makes sense. Okay. And then she adds, with the exception of the first chapter when we're first introduced to him, and there's a lot of people being very polite to each other.
True. That's a fascinating question, Melanie, and it's I'm sure one of us could put together a very lengthy pondering on it, but we'll try to do our best to answer it here. I don't think there's a specific rule or guidelines that we can point to.
Sorry. Oh, man. I didn't expect that. That's great.
No, I didn't either, but when I saw guidelines, that's all I could hear in my head.
They're more like guidelines than actual rules.
Yeah, right. I don't think there is a specific one that we can point to, but Tolkien, obviously a master of the written word, he used words very carefully. So it seems to me that he would have been very deliberate about referring to Bilbo one way or the other. Now
that seems fair. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about how he just doesn't do things by accident very often. Yeah. Sometimes we think that's
occasionally
true.
There are
occasionally you're like, oh, there's an accident, but it's a good one. A quick glance at my ebook tells me there are 61 occurrences of Mr. Baggins. Okay. There are 555 occurrences of the name Bilbo.
That seems like a slight majority.
Yeah, just a bit. Yeah, at least a plurality, at least.
At least.
The simplest option, Bilbo, is clearly more common. Now, it's impossible to speak to every occurrence, but he is called Bilbo at times when he's being very Bagginsy, like in Chapter 2 when he's sadly reflecting that adventures are not all pony rides in May Sunshine. Also when he's being very Tookish, like in Chapter 12 when he taunts Smaug and gets singed. Or when he's got this really good balance between the two when he's giving the Arkenstone to Bard and the Elven King. So there really doesn't seem to be a specific criterion or limiting factor or anything like that for him being called Bilbo. Now, as for Mr. Baggins, many times he's called that in the dialogue of other characters, which, like you mentioned before, Chapter 1 is just characters being polite. Now, when the narrator calls him that, it does seem like in a few cases he's drawing attention to maybe a little bit of irony. Like, Mr. Baggins spent a lot of time at Rivendell looking at Thorin's map when no one else did. Mr. Baggins gets tired of waiting in Smaug's lair and shouted out, "Confound you, Smaug, you worm," when everybody else was scared. Mr. Baggins kept his head clear of the bewitchment of the treasure when everyone else, to one extent or another, gave into it. Now,
so it's like those moments when he's doing things you wouldn't expect the Baggins side of him to be doing.
That's right. So it's almost like an ironic use of the name.
Right.
Now, it could be that Tolkien is intentionally drawing attention to the irony of it being, fussy little Bilbo Baggins doing these things, or there may have been another reason altogether or no reason at all. But clearly, I don't think there's a specific rule that we can define with any level of certainty.
I think I have to agree based on the examples you've cited and, probably a few others that we could find.
Yeah.
It's a great question. It's a really fascinating thought.
It is.
And if someone wants to prove us wrong, I'd love to know about it.
Absolutely.
If somebody out there has
prove
the
Sean
time.
wrong. Prove Sean wrong. I don't want to be proven wrong anymore. I'm tired of it. I'm just tired of it.
You got a little taste of it and you're just like, no, not again.
That's my jail crow. It's us and birds, man. We better be aware because those are our downfalls. Apparently,
we do need to be careful with bird speculation. It is not. It is not our specialty.
Neither of us have done well.
No more ornithological musings.
No.
But seriously, if somebody has the time and the patience to document and analyze every instance of Bilbo naming or Baggins naming in the book, please let us know. I would love to hear about it.
Yeah, because we don't have the time or the patience, just to be very clear.
Sadly, we do not. We got to figure out how we're going to get through Lord of the Rings.
That's right. Well, our next question comes from Martin in Flanders, Belgium, and I sure hope I am pronouncing his name correctly. He says, "It struck me that the way the dwarves are portrayed in The Hobbit is not always as they are shown in the rest of the legendarium, is it? Even though the Quenta is essentially Elvish history, and thus from a biased source not altogether too fond of the dwarves, they contain numerous examples of dwarven heroism. And Bilbo's companions, Thorin and company, fought during the Goblin Wars, and some were there when the dragon came to the mountain. They must have been seasoned warriors. Contrast the role of Gimli, after all Glóin's son, in The Lord of the Rings. Yet during the expedition to Erebor, they are not always shining, are they? What are your thoughts on this apparent dichotomy?" Well, before you start to answer, Sean, because I do have you answering this one, I want to add that listener Chris B. wrote in with a similar question about, and here's a quote from him, "the evolution of Tolkien's dwarf characters from the plunderers of Menegroth to the heroism of Thorin and of Gimli, who may be the greatest dwarf hero of the entire legendarium."
Okay, so we've got a question about sort of the evolution of the depiction of dwarfs from the early legendarium to sort of the sort of mostly bumbling dwarves of Thorin's company to the great hero that is Gimli. I think we have answered this question in a lot of pieces over the course of probably the last 12 episodes or so. But I don't think we've ever brought all the threads together, so I think it's good that we're doing that here.
I think so.
I think really, if you look at the history of Tolkien's composition of the legendarium, the dwarves we see in The Hobbit are kind of transitional because The Hobbit was written at a time when Tolkien was just changing the way he viewed dwarves and the role they played in his legendarium.
That's right.
It was back in episode 74, we answered a question from a listener, Nathaniel, and we talked about the fact that if you look at the earliest writings, like the Book of Lost Tales, dwarves were actually evil. They were
full-blown bad guys.
Yeah, they were allied with orcs and with Melkor. If you go back to the earliest version of what basically became the story of Thingol and the Nauglamir, they killed Thingol, but they did it with allied with orcs and really, really brutally. It was really horrible stuff.
Yeah, terrible.
It was actually much worse than it ended up being in the later Silmarillion, as hard as that may be to believe. At that time, we actually read a little piece from John Rateliff's book about how The Hobbit does show a sudden shift with really no transition.
Yeah, no, it's
from just a break, a clean break from the
0 to 60
dwarves.
in 0.2. Yeah,
right,
I mean, it's
right,
instant shift.
Yeah, from the Book of Lost Tales to dwarves basically being good guys. And Ratliff's quote was, "For them to be treated sympathetically as heroes of the new story, meaning The Hobbit, is nothing short of amazing. No less surprising than if a company of goblin wolf riders had ridden up to Bag End seeking a really first-class burglar."
That is such a strong example.
It is a vivid image, yeah.
He's right, though. I mean, if that's what we're looking at from the Book of Lost Tales version, then just boom. I mean, in no time at all, the dwarves have gone from evil to heroes.
Yeah.
Now, more recently, in episode 85, just a couple episodes back, we discussed that when Tolkien wrote Thorin's death scene, it was the first time that dwarves were even said to have souls.
Right.
In an earlier writing, Tolkien had said that dwarves have no spirit indwelling, as have the children of the Creator. We're talking about elves and men. And they go back into the stone of the mountains of which they were made. Well, after he wrote Thorin's death scene, he went back to the Quenta and edited that to allow for a dwarvish afterlife. That's also when he added in the idea that Ilúvatar would accept them after death, or, as it's worded in the published Silmarillion, they became the children of his adoption. So what we're seeing here is that Tolkien apparently changed his thoughts about the dwarves as he was writing The Hobbit. And then, by the time he got to The Lord of the Rings and the later drafts of the Silmarillion, they were capable of great nobility and heroism, best exemplified in Gimli.
Yeah, that's true. And we do see a little bit of that Gimli-style heroism from some of the dwarves in The Hobbit. We just don't see it much in Thorin's party.
No,
I would say that
much. We see some, but yeah.
We see some a little bit at the end, the Battle of Five Armies, and they have a few moments throughout.
Yeah.
But we mostly see it through Dain and his elite dwarven army.
The elites.
Yeah. And through Dain's actions, the great choices that he makes and the great leadership he shows.
Yeah.
But I think that still makes sense because even in the context of the Legendarium, most of the dwarves in Thorin's party were not seasoned warriors.
No.
A few of them were.
Sure.
But not all of them were. And even those that did have some battle experience were all exiles. They were down on their luck. And I think all of Thorin's party, I would say, including Thorin himself, even though Thorin had his heroism moment in the Goblin Wars in the past.
With the Oak and Shield moniker.
Yeah, right, exactly. But by the time you see him in The Hobbit, he's down on his luck, and I think I think he's meant to come across as a bit hopeless, a bit hapless, if you want to put it that way. And I think they're meant to because these dwarves are people who have fallen from their former glory. They just don't. They don't have it anymore.
No.
Whereas Dain, as the lord of his own realm, has managed to keep his dignity and his power and his glory.
Yeah, he definitely has, which is more than I can say for myself.
Very good, very good. Well, let's see. Let's move on to the next question. This one comes to us from Pyatt G. in Birmingham, Alabama.
Okay.
He says, "Love the podcast, guys." Thank you, Pyatt.
Yeah.
Can y'all allow a question? Yes, we can. Comment really on Chapter 1. He says, it's about Gandalf's tales of the unexpected luck of widows' sons. Yes, it's foreshadowing, but am I totally from left field if I imagine this may have been about Tuor? Rhiann was, after all, a widow when she gave birth to Tuor, and this contrasts well with Turin. It's far-fetched, but surely Gandalf knew the history and likely would have told some version of it. I'm going with this regardless of what y'all say, by the way.
I love that. I love that.
Perfect. That's
Even
great,
if you
Pyatt.
tell me I'm wrong, this is my version. I'm sticking to it.
That's the beauty. That's the beauty of the open interpretation, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We might have our answer, and it might be different from yours, Pyatt. But hey, you're allowed yours. But what do you think, Alan? Maybe far-fetched, but I don't know. Is it a maybe?
There's no reason to think that it is specifically a reference to Tuor, but I suppose it's not impossible that one of the wonderful tales that Gandalf used to tell at parties was about Tuor. By the way, I would advise him not to tell the story of Turin at parties because that's a real downer.
It really is a downer. And you don't want the children present for a lot of it.
No, you do not. No, you do not. And if that's the case, then maybe all young Bilbo remembered was that he was a widow's son with unexpected good luck. I mean, I don't know. It does feel a bit stretchy to me, but there is that.
I mean, now that you say that, I'm kind of trying to think back to that entire sentence to see what all the stories Bilbo was thinking of, because he says dragons and goblins and giants and the rescue of princesses and the unexpected luck of widows' sons.
Yeah, that's right.
So dragons, what, maybe Glaurung and Turin? Goblins, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears.
Sure, maybe.
I'm not sure what to make of giants.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Maybe the Ents that were there towards the end of the Silmarillion.
Could be.
But then, the rescue of princesses, well, come on, Luthien rescued herself. Let's give credit where credit's due.
Our princess is in another castle.
Nice.
Sorry.
No, it's great. Your Mario reference for the day. But it's not impossible that Tolkien was inspired by himself here.
Sure. I mean, we see it happen all the time, yeah.
Yeah, but I think I tend to think that it's probably more just the foreshadowing of Bilbo's own story.
Sure.
And probably just something that sounds like a pitch for an exciting story.
That's true, yeah.
I mean, Widow's Son sounds exotic. It sounds interesting and all that. But I don't know. Who knows? I mean, a few episodes ago, I said pretty matter-of-factly that Bilbo must have known who the necromancer was because he must have known the story of Beren and Luthien. And quite a few people disagreed with me about that. I still think I'm right, but lots of people disagreed. So Pyatt, I'm not going to say you're wrong.
There you go.
It's a cool theory.
There you go. Well, I have to wonder if the widow's son's inspiration, and I don't mean to go too far afield here, but comes out of Scripture. My first thought when I read that the first time in the text was thinking back to these two incidents about the only sons of widows being raised from the dead, which, well, strikes me as being pretty darn lucky.
Wow.
Elijah is said to have raised a widow's son from death in 1 Kings 17, and then in Luke 7, probably more well known, Jesus is said to have raised the son of a widow in a village. By the way, this is interesting. Get this. The village was called Nain, like Dane's father. But anyway.
Like N-A-I-N.
N-A-I-N. N-A-I-N,
Oh, wow.
Nain. Yeah.
Huh.
So, yeah.
Wow.
Anyway.
So it could just be Tolkien, just kind of
bringing back something that he
digging for a folklore reference.
Inspiration. Yeah, exactly. Folklore, inspiration comes from everywhere. But like I said, I'm not sure you get more lucky than to be resurrected, but that's a whole other ball of wax. So
no kidding.
Next we have one, and this is a good one, from our old friend Tanya P. in New York. She says, "You've been talking a lot about how in Tolkien's world, luck and chance are synonymous with the hand of Iluvatar manipulating the events to bring closer the fulfillment of the master plan. But what about the ill chance, or instances where chance caused some very negative events? There aren't many examples in Lord of the Rings, only Aragorn lamenting his choices after he brought the company to Parth Galen, where he says, 'An ill fate is on me this day, and all that I do goes amiss.' But the examples are abundant in the Silmarillion. The best example is Gelmir being brought by orcs to the exact place where his brother Gwyndor could witness his execution.
Mm-hmm.
It caused a premature start of the Nirnaeth Arnoediad and the capture of Gwyndor himself. One can even argue that this random event caused the fall of Nargothrond, or Eol and Arathel, where it chanced that Arathel got lost in Nan Elmoth.
Yeah.
So Tanya goes on to give a few more examples and then says this: in every example that I gave, Tolkien explicitly mentions ill fate or ill chance. So how should we interpret all these events? Could Iluvatar consciously sacrifice so many of his children for the sake of the plan? Or maybe there were other powers at work. But if so, then all chances really are random and may not come from Iluvatar at all. Oof. Oh, man, that's a hard question.
Can I let you have this one? I should have read that question and let you have the first crack at the answer. But, oh well. We put them in this order. It played out this way.
It did.
Alan, if you can be the word nerd sometimes, maybe I can try a little theological speculation within Middle-earth this time.
Go for it.
And honestly, this is a question that I would say theologians have been debating in the real world for centuries. I mean, it's the question of right, exactly. It's the question of theodicy, isn't it? Which I think you talked about with John Garth back in episode 44. The question of why is there evil at work in a world that's created by an omnipotent and a benevolent God, like Eru Iluvatar within the context of Middle-earth. And Tolkien doesn't really give any easy answers for that. And I
don't think there are any.
I don't think there are. I think he was smart enough to know, wise enough to know that there are not.
Yeah.
And I would have to say that each person's answer to that question about Middle-earth is probably going to have a lot to do with what they believe about the real world.
Yeah.
And that's not I'm not going to go there, but I will say that within Tolkien's writing.
Oh, a good idea.
Yeah. But I will say that within Tolkien's writing, I would explain it like this. There is evil in Arda because it is Arda Mard.
Mm-hmm.
Everything in creation has what Tolkien calls, in his own words, a Melkor ingredient.
Right.
He mentions that in Morgoth's Ring, one of his essays in there.
Yeah.
And because of this Melkor ingredient, there is evil in creation. But thanks to the doctrine of Spabimi, shall prove but mine instrument, going back to, what was that, episode 5, episode 6?
5,
For anybody who missed our earliest episodes in the Silmarillion. Because of the ultimate doctrine of Spabimi, all of these bad things will eventually add up to things more wonderful, and this comes from the Silmarillion, things more wonderful, which he, Melkor, himself hath not imagined. So even luck, chance, fate, these forces at work in the world can be good or bad because it's part of the wheels of the world, but it will eventually be turned into something good by Iluvatar's divine plan.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean it's good for the people who experience the ill fate directly. I mean, it can be very bad for them. Just
quite ultimately bad.
Just ask Arathel how well that worked out for her and her family, or Turgon, or everyone who was alive in Gondolin when it was destroyed, or Gelmir. Yeah, I mean,
there's my hand. There's my other hand.
'Tis but a scratch.
Come back here, I'll bleed on you.
But so it can be very bad for the people who are, or let's look at somebody like Turin, and all the horrible things that,
his whole story,
everything he does goes wrong.
Yeah.
But out of these bad things that happen to people come things more wonderful. And out of something as horrible as the destruction of Gondolin, which came out of Maiglin and Arathel and Eol, out of that comes Eärendil. Yeah. And all of his descendants, Elrond.
That's right.
And Arwen and Aragorn and all of those. So I think that illustrates how things can be very bad for people when they're living it. But in the end, it all kind of, I don't know, in the grand scheme of things, it all turns out okay. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add, supplement, or debate?
I don't know about debate. I don't know if this will help or not. I think she's talking specifically about ill chance or ill fate. But I think we have to see a lot of those things as still the results of people's choices, or even the choices of orcs. It's by the choices of sentient beings. But if we do that, then we can start talking about the notion of two wills in God. We talked about this once before, in this case, Iluvatar. And I think that might be, this notion of two wills, what underlies the tension that Tolkien creates here with this really fine balance. Now, the idea, to kind of recap, is that there is this eternal will, God's, or in this case again, Iluvatar's eternal will, sometimes called absolute will. Now, that would be Iluvatar's decree that refers to what shall be, what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Then there's his revealed will, okay? And this would be referred to as a moral will or even a permissive will, because that concerns what should be. So this is where it's tough, because these two wills exist simultaneously. There's the eternal will, that which shall be, cannot be thwarted. That's the doctrine of Spabimi at work right there. It will infallibly come to pass. But the moral will, that which should be, doesn't always happen because people have moral free agency and the ability to make choices. This is not an example of ill fate or ill luck, so I'm not really directly answering your question. I'm using this more as an illustration of this concept of two wills. But an example would be
I think we talked about this back when, maybe the Turin episodes, and I think we were talking about
that sounds right.
And all that stuff, yeah.
Yeah,
anyway.
The Boethius thing, I'm sure we talked about it then. But an in-universe example would be the third of the kinslayings, right? I mean, this is a great moral evil, something that Iluvatar's moral will says should never, ever have happened. Mm-hmm. But in the end, Iluvatar's eternal will is accomplished because through Ulmo, Iluvatar works this to ultimate good by bearing Elwing out of the sea, bringing her to Eärendil, which leads him to finally make it to Valinor to make his plea for men and elves. So Iluvatar's absolute will,
which would also look to, an observer as boy, that was really lucky that Elwing found
Right.
Eärendil.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To an outsider who doesn't, certainly Ulmo probably didn't do so visibly, presumably, but we don't know. So anyway, the idea here is that Eru's absolute will that the Valar would eventually lead the fight against Morgoth and remove him from Arda was accomplished, even though his revealed will, don't kill each other, children, wasn't obeyed. Now, I know that doesn't directly address the idea of ill chance. I don't know that I can answer that more directly, but I think that it does stem from this concept of two wills in Iluvatar. I'm sure that's a doctrine that Tolkien would have been familiar with. So, it's
interesting.
It's not an easy thing to grasp, and I probably just summarized something that you really should read in an entire book. But
well, but I mean, I think this is the kind of thing that you get a sense of this when you read some of the later stuff like Morgoth's Ring, and I know Tanya's written to us enough.
She knows more about Morgoth's Ring than I do.
Communicated with her enough that she knows a lot about the history of Middle Earth, and I'm sure this will resonate with her. Some of the later stuff that's in Morgoth's Ring and stuff. There's a lot about this kind of speculation about the nature of evil and all that stuff. So it's a tough one. I hope we've done a pretty good job with it. But
I hope
there
so.
You go.
I mean, I guess the only other thing I would add is that I think, and I already mentioned this, but I just want to touch on it again. Not every moment that is described as chance, especially when it's described as ill luck or ill chance, was necessarily just luck. It was the decision of somebody who did it. I mean, it may have been random in some ways. I mean, where they took Gelmir, for instance, that's a great example she gives. That does seem like, really, the orcs couldn't have known, but they certainly knew that his people were there. I mean, that's the intention that they had was to get the result that they got, which was to prod them into charging, into leaving their safe, defensible positions. The fact that was more effective because his brother was there, bonus. But that was certainly what they were trying to do. So it was the actions of creatures with moral free will, to some extent, because then you get into the whole issue of, do orcs have moral free will or not? I don't know. Now we're getting a whole other ball of wax.
That's a deep question. Yeah,
that's a very deep question. I'm not going to touch on that one.
But it does seem like, Tolkien does seem to be saying that it was ill luck that his brother was there, though.
He actually says it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that brings up the question: was that luck, or did Iluvatar manipulate it so that he was there? I think my whole point is that something that's described as ill luck is still the result of the action of individual characters.
Well, and as we've talked about throughout The Hobbit, even good luck comes to nothing without the action of individual characters with free will.
I don't know. That's tough.
So I suppose there's that. That is kind of a tough one. I'm not
sure
where I'm. It is a tough one, man.
It is. That's brutal.
I don't know.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks for giving us a question that can't possibly be answered.
It's a great question, Tanya.
I'm surprised you didn't just say, what's the answer to life, the universe, and everything?
Well, we know that one.
We all know it's 42, but then you can't know the question, because if you know the question in the same universe that the answer, then the universe is destroyed and starts over again.
Right. Well, thank you, Tanya. Fantastic question. I don't know how well we answered it, but
spectacular question. Yeah,
we gave it a shot.
We tried.
All right. Well, I'm going to move on to a question from Chris S. in Indianapolis. Back around episode 67, Chris wrote in saying, "You made an interesting point in attributing Gandalf's skill with fire to his Ring of Power. I know his ring is called the Ring of Fire. The Ring of Fire. But it has never been my interpretation that this is the case. The description of that ring's power talks about kindling hope in the heart of men and elves, or something like that. Fire in a metaphorical sense, rather than giving power over fire itself. Of course, the ring's powers aren't clearly spelled out anywhere, but can you give me your thinking behind your conclusion?" And it's interesting that he said that, because, Alan, I remember when Jeff fielded that question for us about Gandalf's D&D spellbook back in episode 83.
Yeah.
One thing, I don't think we got into the episode, but it was part of his written response, which is up on our website, said something similar. It said it would be easy to say that it would give Gandalf all kinds of cool spells of flame, and then he listed a few D&D, fire spells. But he said, I don't think it's right. Its fire is more metaphysical most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, obviously there is this interpretation out there that the Ring of Fire is more of a metaphorical or metaphysical fire as opposed to a direct elemental fire. So,
right.
I don't know. What do you think, Alan? Are we off base if we continue to think of Narya as giving actual fire powers?
I fell into a burning ring of fire. See, I can't stop thinking about that song now. All right.
It might be easier to just sit here and just do some Johnny Cash karaoke than continue to answer any of these
Well, certainly
questions.
if the questions are as stinking hard as Tanya's was.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
I agree. The kindling that Narya does is often more metaphorical, but I have to say, really, I do believe it seems to grant actual physical fire powers too, if for no other reason than the fact that we see that happen. Gandalf actually does fire magic, from his fireworks to his pine cones of multiple colors, I might add, to his light up staff, which he manages to do without batteries. Gandalf actually does wield fire in a very literal way. Now, where do those powers come from, if not his ring? Now, he's not that kind of wizard, as we always say, so we know it's not from studying some ancient arcane arts.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to be anything inherent to his Maya nature. I mean, as a Maya, he was a servant of Lorien. He spent a lot of time with Nienna, and he was chosen to join the Astari by Manwë himself and by Varda. None of those Valar have anything to do with fire, so
True.
Those powers have to come from somewhere. The ring, seeing as how it's called the Ring of Fire, does seem the only other option. So as much as it also confers the metaphorical kindling powers, I think we have to conclude that it grants some degree of actual elemental power as well.
I agree with you completely. And I would add one other example for sake of comparison. Galadriel. Remember, her ring is Menya, the Ring of Water.
Ring of Water.
And what's the main magical thing she's known for?
That's right.
The thing she does that she explains to Sam is what your folk would call magic.
I believe
the mirror.
This is what your folk would call magic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The mirror and the vial.
And the vial.
Which contains the light that's captured in her fountain. Those are
all
both
water.
Examples of powerful water magic that no ordinary elf should have those powers, even one of the Noldor. So I think based on, seeing Gandalf do magic with fire and seeing, or magia, maybe we should call it, based on Tolkien's own words. He doesn't use ordinary magic.
Good point.
And Galadriel do quote unquote magic with water. I think the evidence really is strongly suggesting that the Elven rings actually give elemental powers along with, any sort of metaphorical effect, that comes with that. And of course, there's the general power of preservation that they all have.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think we speculated a little bit about that when we were wondering about Elrond's ring, which is the Ring of Air. And we were trying to figure out how that gave him power over the river.
Over the fords, yeah, that's right.
And I was just thinking of like some sort of almost a force field, so to speak, that would kind of wall up the water.
Right.
So he's not he's not having power over the water, he's having power over this field of air.
Right.
And then he,
that was a fun speculation. I remember that. That was cool.
Yeah. So it's maybe that's what's going on. I don't know. Well, next up, we've got another word from Trotter in the UK, who we mentioned earlier at the beginning of the episode. He wrote to us about Mirkwood. He says, I'm always struck by the fact that when they first meet the elves are in a circle or a fairy ring. And I believe that fairy rings were thought to be ways to enter fairy, and people were warned not to enter a fairy ring. Numerous references to things disappearing as well if you enter the circle. I think Tolkien may be saying that Bilbo and the dwarves are in Middle-earth, and they are seeing a portal into fairy, but the elves do not allow them to enter. Tolkien does appear to contradict my argument later on when he describes that the wood elves never went to fairy, but I still think it's a fairy ring. Now, he also shared a link to some information online that goes into the concept a little more. For folks who aren't familiar with it, we'll put some links up on our website about the idea of fairy rings being a portal into the fairy world. But in the meantime, Sean, what do you have in terms of an answer?
Well, it's a great insight, and
it is.
I think it's really cool. Thank you, Trotter, for bringing that up. The idea that he's talking about is, this idea from fairy folklore that the fairy world is basically almost like another plane of existence that you can enter through a portal. There are these places where our world touches the fairy world or the other world. And that is an idea that Tolkien, he wasn't opposed to. In fact, there's an essay by him in Verlin Flieger's edition of Smith of Wooten Major.
Okay.
But there's an essay that Tolkien wrote where he talks about the position of fairy in time and space, and he's talking about something very much like this. So he was aware of the idea. And it fits. I think The Hobbit, we talked about, it's filled with these fairy elements. And as we've discovered, it's, Mirkwood specifically is full of references to fairy folklore. I mean, most of the ones that we mentioned, the hunt and the deer, those all came from the Mirkwood, part.
Right.
I would say that after Trotter sent this to us, I went back into some of our sources, and I did find that John Rateliff actually does make the exact same comparison.
Oh, of course.
In one of the of course, he always finds this stuff before we do.
Yeah.
In the history of The Hobbit, he says, Tolkien's wood elves are recognizably the elves of folklore belief. And in the next paragraph, he says, there are hints that the forest clearings are enchanted spots, for example, elf rings or fairy circles. And then he uses the term fairy ring in the very next sentence.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's absolutely there. John Rateliff has made a note of it. We didn't bring it up back in episode 70 when we talked about this because it was such a quick mention and we had a lot to cover. But it is in there.
Three, yeah.
We did, but it is in there. So just proof for everybody that even though it might seem like we're trying to read every single word of Ratliff's book, we are not. There's a ton of stuff in there that we haven't touched on.
A ton. It's a huge book. One you should buy using the affiliate links on our website, by the way.
Absolutely. But I would say Trotter, I think you're right on. Mm-hmm. Well, finally, our last question of the episode comes from Paul R. in Guelph, Ontario. Once Season 2 is complete, and you're on break before Season 3, for the hiatus, could you recommend one or two non-legendarium works of Tolkien we should read? Whether Tree and Leaf or Smith of Wooten Major, or whatever you might suggest. Kind of like homework. Good homework.
Yeah, the best kind of homework.
That's right.
Well, Paul, you can't really go wrong with either of the suggestions you just named. But for other stuff, Sean, what do you think?
I agree. And I would say that if you want to buy one book for your non-legendarium needs for your summer reading, pick up a copy of Tales from the Perilous Realm.
Yeah.
That has a little bit of everything. I mean,
or a lot of everything, as the case may be.
It's true. It's got quite a bit of everything.
Yeah.
That's got, I'll try and get through these quickly, but I want to talk about all of them.
Sure.
You got Farmer Giles of Ham, which is a really funny take on some of these dragon story tropes that we've been talking about.
Blunderbuss. Yeah, it's hilarious, yes.
There's The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which is actually a collection of poems that are from the Red Book of Westmarch. And a few of those poems you will know if you've read Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
There's Roverandom.
And a few of them will creep you out. The Mulips.
Yeah. Yep. And the Sea Bell. There's some really deep and some sad ones in there.
Yeah, sorrow, so much sorrow.
Yep. There's Roverandom in that volume, which is a fairy tale about a wizard, a dog, and the man in the moon, which, come on, do I need to say more?
Yeah, seriously.
It's also got Smith of Wooten Major, my favorite non-legendarium story, which has some surprising connections to, I'd say, both the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings, which I will be talking about a lot.
Yes, I think we will. Definitely read that. Now, the volume, if you're talking about the more recent edition of it, also includes the two writings that make up the bulk of Tree and Leaf. Leaf by Niggle, which is just a really lovely allegory. It's arguably the only one Tolkien ever wrote, unless you count part of his essay on Beowulf, about subcreation, creation, and, well, look, I don't want to spoil the rest. We're going to get to it at some point. But, Tree and Leaf also includes, or I should say, Tales from the Perilous Realm also includes On Fairy Stories, which we reference on this show all the time and is truly required reading for the Prancing Pony podcast. That was written after The Hobbit, just as Tolkien was starting The Lord of the Rings, so it's a great explanation of his thoughts on his art and the fantasy genre in general at the very point in his career that we're about to embark on. And on top of all that, most current editions of Tales from the Perilous Realm feature some wonderful art by Alan Lee and an essay from Tom Shippey.
That's right.
If you're talking about reading in preparation for upcoming episodes, well, Sean, why don't we go ahead and talk a little bit about what's coming up that people might want to read ahead for?
Because in just 3 weeks, we're going to be releasing an interview with Dr. Verlin Flieger.
Yep.
Professor Flieger is Professor Emerita in the Department of English at the University of Maryland at College Park, and she's a prolific Tolkien scholar.
Prolific is putting it mildly, yes.
Yes, it is. It really is. She's the author of several things you've heard us talk about, Splintered Light, Logos and Language in Tolkien's World, as well as a number of other books and essays. She's also edited a lot of Tolkien's own works for publication. She did a 2005 edition of Smith of Wooten Major, which I think I mentioned earlier in this episode. Yep. It's been a long one, so I can't remember for sure. But
how many times have you mentioned Smith?
I know, right? She also edited the recently released Story of Kullervo, The Lay of Outru and Itrun, and she co-edited an expanded edition of On Fairy Stories with Douglas A. Anderson.
That's right.
She's been very, very busy, and we'll be talking to her about all of her work, or as much as we can fit in a single episode, including her latest essay collection, which is called There Would Always Be a Fairy Tale, More Essays on Tolkien. So pick up as many of those as you can and read them in the next few weeks before episode 90 comes out.
Yeah, because that is going to be just a spectacular conversation. Sean and I are really looking forward to having Dr. Flieger on the show, and it is just going to be such a privilege to be able to speak with her. I think we've been wanting to do that for a long time, but Professor Drout's appearance on the show back in January really prompted us to go ahead and consider reaching out, and she's been just a pleasure to work with, so we're looking forward to that. Yeah. Now, that will be the last episode of Season 2 before we go on hiatus, but then when we come back, we're still not done. Episode 91 will be an interview with Dr. Tom Shippey. Professor Shippey is a medievalist and Tolkien scholar who has taught at no less than 6 universities, including St. John's College, Oxford, and the University of Leeds, where he held the chair of English language and medieval English literature that J.R.R. Tolkien himself held in the 20s. Now, he's also the author of The Road to Middle-earth, J.R.R. Tolkien, author of the century, and he's the author of that introduction of the current edition of, what do you know, Tales of the Perilous Realm. Now, we'll be talking to him about Tolkien and medievalism and even his latest book, which isn't Tolkien, but is something you still ought to consider getting. It's called Laughing Shall I Die? Lives and Deaths of the Great Vikings, which is going to be an excellent book about a topic that we think a lot of you are going to be interested in.
I'm really looking forward to all of those. But yeah, also the Laughing Shall I Die book, because that just seems like a fascinating treatment of that topic.
It really does.
And we're incredibly excited about having Dr. Shippey on. And I should point out that he was also the person who inspired us to take an objective look at Peter Jackson's films. Yeah. Remember back in episodes 50 and 51, it was Tom Shippey who gave that lecture about, Tolkien's own words about the canons of narrative art.
That's right.
That gave us that test for evaluating those changes on a more objective basis.
It really helped frame the conversation.
Yes.
For how we were going to discuss those movies. Really
absolutely did, and kept us from ranting too much.
Yes. Though I have a feeling that if they will allow us, these episodes are going to be very long. If they'll allow us. They might be short. Who knows? They might get tired of us very quickly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to all of you who wrote into Barliman's Bag. There are still a few unanswered questions about the first age and the third age in the mailbag. Guess what? No second age questions, Sean.
That's true.
But I think that pretty much gets us through all of the Hobbit questions and brings us to the end of our show. But don't tune out just yet.
No, don't, because next week is when we'll be at Myth Moot 5.
Yay!
We'll be airing that live on Facebook at the time of the event, Saturday, June 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We're also going to put that up on the podcast feed as episode 88 the following Sunday, or as soon after as my co-host can get it edited.
Yeah, hopefully that'll be Sunday. Well, following that, we'll release our next Questions After Nightfall episode as episode 89. We'll be joined by several of our listeners for another live recorded Q&A. Always a fun time to stump the hosts. And then after that, episode 90, which we just talked about with Dr. Verlin Flieger.
And then after that will be our brief hiatus. We're just going to be taking off for a few weeks, and then we'll be coming back with episode 91 and Tom Shippey in mid-August.
But while we're off, we'll still be around on social media. Barliman will still be bringing us the mail. And most importantly, we will still be working on a number of things related to the podcast, all of which are done with an eye towards making things better in Season 3.
And we're planning on doing the same thing between each season going forward. I think not only is that going to keep things fresh and entertaining, or at least as entertaining as we can be.
Oh, there's that low bar again.
Yep, always. But it will also give us a chance to prepare for each upcoming season more thoroughly. So there it is. Now, if you have any questions about the hiatus or anything else, just let us know on social media by emailing Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com.
Now, we're not going to ask you for anything, but if you would like to see how we're doing towards our Patreon goals, you can see them at patreon.com/prancingponypod.
And of course, we do want to give a very special shout out to our patrons at the Cure Dance contribution tier: DeMay in Alaska, James in Virginia, Tamsin in Minnesota, Don in Vancouver Island, and Emily in Texas. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And folks, that almost wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. As always, thank you very much for joining us. And while we are up in the air on our way to Virginia, we invite you to please check out the official library tab on our website, theprancingponypodcast.com. We've got links to everything from inexpensive paperbacks to the really good stuff for your Tolkien collection.
And if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes for us and leaving a review, we'd love that. We really thank you for that.
Really
Those reviews help us get more visibility in iTunes, and that translates to a bigger community of Tolkien lovers.
And thank you to those of you who have. Not only do we still read every single one of them, but we are also featuring one each week on our social media networks on #ThankfulThursdays. Now, make sure you never miss an episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Please subscribe to the show through iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
And we want to thank all of you who've become part of our social media circles. We set out to start a Tolkien conversation that everyone could join. That's why we have our online common room on Facebook at the Prancing Pony Podcast, on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod, and on Instagram at Prancing Pony Pod.
And one last thing as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and your summer reading plans to Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com, and we'll try to get them into our next episode. As always, no matter how much time we've had, it is still far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
Farewell, friends.